morning haze of Lagos rises with the heat and noise of the city's pulse. Cars honking like alarms, Danfo buses belching black smoke, while conductors dangle from the doors, shouting destinations with unrelenting urgency. On a worn concrete bench outside the Zenith Bank on Herbert Macaulay Way, an old woman sits, untouched by the chaos around her. Mama Ruth, 78, wears a navy blue wrapper and matching scarf tucked carefully beneath her chin. Her back is straight, despite her age, and her eyes remain fixed on something invisible ahead, not the flurry of movement that surrounds her. On her lap lies a faded green file folder, its corners worn soft, as if it had passed through many hands or waited too long in too many places. Most mornings, she is part of the street's rhythm now. The kiosk seller nods at her. A traffic warden occasionally glances her way. Pedestrians pass, some slowing as they spot her again. Every day for the last 3 months, Mama Ruth has been in that same spot, come sun or drizzle. Some pity her, pausing for a second look. Others smirk knowingly. She don't come again. Old people and their madness, they mutter, brushing past her as if she were part of the city's furniture. But Mama Ruth doesn't flinch, doesn't speak, unless spoken to. She simply waits. Just before noon, a Bolt car weaves through the gridlock and pulls up beside the curb. Amaka steps out, tall and sharply dressed in a navy blazer that mirrors her grandmother's scarf. Her face tightens when she sees the familiar silhouette on the bench. She walks over quickly, her heels clicking on the pavement, drawing looks from bystanders. "Nama, not again," she says, her voice half pleading, half scolding. "I've told you, this is not safe. You can't keep coming out here like this. What if something happens to you?" Mama Ruth turns to her granddaughter slowly. There's no irritation in her face, only quiet resolve. "I'm waiting for someone," she says calmly, patting the file on her lap. "I need to give them something." Amaka sighs, glancing at the small crowd beginning to form a discreet ring around them. She hates this, the attention, the whispers, the feeling that something in her family is unraveling in public. She takes Mama Ruth gently by the arm, helping her into the waiting car. Inside the car, Amaka rubs her temples while Mama Ruth stares out the window in silence, the file still clutched to her chest. Amaka doesn't ask what's in it anymore. She's heard the story too many times. An old savings account, a promise never fulfilled, a man who said he'd return. To Amaka, it's just another version of her grandmother's fading memory, slipping further from the present with each passing week. But that night, long after the city's noise has thinned into distant murmurs, Mama Ruth stirs from her bed. Careful not to wake anyone, she dresses in the dark, slips the file into her handbag, and walks quietly into the night. By dawn, she is back on her bench, her gaze steady, the file resting once more on her lap, waiting. Before the wrinkles settle deep into her skin and the years press down on her spine, Mama Ruth had been a schoolteacher, stern, deliberate, respected. Back then, she taught English at a modest public secondary school in Surulere, her chalk handwriting neat and slanted just so, her voice calm but final. Her life had been a quiet progression of routine, morning prayers, classroom bells, lesson notes, and after-school tutoring. She married young, lost her husband younger, and never remarried. It was the kind of loss that silenced her further. But even then, she never allowed herself the indulgence of grief in public. When her only child, Adobe, died giving birth to the youngest of her 4 children, Mama Ruth didn't cry at the funeral. She simply gathered the children, took them home, and began again. There was no time to break. Now at 78, she lives alone in a small one-room boys' quarters, tucked behind the spacious duplex of her eldest granddaughter, Amaka, in Aja. It's a quiet room, one iron bed with a thin mattress, a plastic table with a lace cloth, and a rickety wardrobe she's had for decades, everything in its place. She does not ask for more, she never has. Amaka, 32, is everything Mama Ruth never had time or room to become. Ambitious, driven, self-made. She clawed her way from scarcity to soft luxury, from hand-me-downs to statement blazers and tech jobs with international clients. Her flat is minimalist and pristine, her English flawless, her Yoruba now patchy. She's careful with her image, with her words, with her time. And though she never says it out loud, she carries a deep, unspoken shame of where she came from, of the dust, the noise, the crude mannerisms, the poverty. Mama Ruth's past feels like a weight she's constantly trying to shed. But the shame isn't the whole story. There's also guilt, a thick, persistent guilt that clings to her like humidity. She knows she's emotionally absent, that her love is functional, performative, food deliveries, new wrappers, visits to the clinic when necessary. But she tells herself it's survival, that she's doing what must be done. After all, didn't Mama Ruth teach her to strive, to never settle? Isn't this what it means to succeed? Her siblings have taken the lesson to heart as well, though in different ways. David, 28, is in the UK on a master's scholarship. His WhatsApp replies infrequent. His voice notes clipped. He sends money sometimes, but never calls unless reminded. Nina, 24, lives in Lekki and curates a digital life full of waist trainers and brand endorsements. She calls Mama Ruth, my queen, on birthdays, but hasn't visited in almost a year. And then there's Sei, the youngest, a first-year student at Unilag, buried in schoolwork and Netflix, barely aware of anything beyond his hostel and his phone. They all love Mama Ruth. At least, they think they do. But no one really asks how she is. No one knows what her days look like, what she thinks about when she's alone, or what she feels when they forget her. They assume her silence is peace, that her stillness means she needs nothing, and she never says otherwise. What they don't see, what none of them have bothered to understand, is her quiet ritual. Every morning, before the city wakes, Mama Ruth dresses carefully, folds a wrapper over her waist, and tucks a file into her handbag. The file is old, the paper inside yellowed with time. The name on it reads Emmanuel Nduka, a name no one in the family has ever mentioned, a name Amaka has never thought to ask about. Then Mama Ruth boards a bus to the Zenith Bank on the island and settles on the concrete bench outside. There, she waits. Not aimlessly, not idly, she waits with purpose. The bank staff have grown accustomed to her presence. At first they assumed she was confused, then simply eccentric. But she returns every day with the same calm, the same patience. A security guard, Chike, sometimes brings her bread and akara in the mornings. He once asked why she came, and she smiled but said nothing. He gave up asking. To most, she's just another Lagos oddity. To herself, she's simply fulfilling a promise. She's not senile. She's not lost. She's waiting for something real. At home, Amaka tries not to think too hard about it. She's had the argument before, about safety, about embarrassment, about dignity. But Mama Ruth is always composed, always firm. I'm waiting for someone, she says, with a conviction Amaka doesn't understand. And so the ritual continues. Mama Ruth slips out quietly at dawn, the file always with her, always clutched to her side, like it contains the last truth of her life. No one in the family knows who Emmanuel Nduka is. No one's ever bothered to ask, but he waits there too. His name inked on a brittle page, tucked deep inside the file on Mama Ruth's lap, beneath the weight of years and all. The things that have been left unsaid. It happened on a sweltering Wednesday morning, the kind of Lagos heat that feels personal. like the sun is punishing the city for existing. The traffic roared as usual, Danfo buses spat curses and fumes, and hawkers darted between cars shouting prices. On her usual bench outside Zenith Bank, Mama Ruth sat, quiet and unmoving, the file on her lap, her scarf perfectly pinned beneath her chin. But something was different. Her posture slackened, her head tilted forward just slightly. A passerby noticed first, a woman selling boiled groundnuts, who paused mid-sale, then the security guard, Chaiki, who dropped his bottle of water and rushed toward her. Within seconds, the street's noise receded, swallowed by panic. Mama Ruth had collapsed. By the time Amaka got the call, her hands were trembling. She left her workstation without shutting down her laptop, nearly knocking over a chair in her rush. The ride to the hospital felt both endless and immediate. Her thoughts raced. What if it was a stroke? What if this was the end? What if all the warnings, all the scoldings, all the nights she told herself, "I'll talk to her tomorrow," had run out of tomorrows? At the hospital, the corridors smelled of antiseptic and faint despair. Amaka arrived to find her grandmother lying unconscious, pale and fragile, beneath a hospital sheet. A nurse explained that she had fainted from heat exhaustion and low blood sugar. Nothing immediately fatal, but serious enough for concern. They were running more tests. For now, she needed rest. As Amaka sat in the waiting area, clutching her handbag like a lifeline, a nurse approached and held out something. "She was holding this," the woman said gently, handing Amaka the file, faded, frayed at the corners, but gripped so tightly by Mama Ruth that her fingers had left creases in the cover. Amaka stared at it for a moment. She'd seen it so many times, that damned file. It had become a prop in their ongoing argument, evidence of her grandmother's stubbornness. But now something shifted in her. Maybe it was the sterile scent of the hospital, or the beeping machines, or the sight of Mama Ruth's still body just down the corridor. Maybe it was guilt, long buried, rising like steam. Amaka opened the file. Inside, carefully arranged and wrapped in a protective plastic sleeve, was a land title document. The seal at the top bore the stamp of the Lagos Ministry of Lands, dated decades back. Her eyes moved to a yellowed envelope, sealed and addressed in elegant cursive. "Mr. Emmanuel Naduka, in trust for my grandchildren." Amaka blinked. Beneath it, folded neatly, was a receipt from Union Bank dated 1985. A fixed deposit of 15,000 naira. She did the mental math. In today's terms, that amount was enough to buy a small house then. She felt her stomach turn. What is this? Who is Emmanuel Nduka? Why had Mama Ruth never spoken of any land, any money, any man by that name? Questions roared in her head, none with answers. For a moment, Amaka sat frozen, the file spread open in her lap. Then, unbidden, memories began to filter in, like dust rising in sunlight. She saw flashes. A much younger Mama Ruth in a chalk-dusted classroom, writing on a blackboard while students repeated words in chorus. Another flash, a man in a faded army uniform, hugging her tightly, whispering something in her ear before climbing onto the back of a military truck. Then again, a younger version of Mama Ruth standing outside the same bank. Not as an old woman, but still dignified, still waiting, her eyes filled with hope instead of weariness. Amaka shut the file gently and looked down the hallway toward her grandmother's room. Something in her had shifted. The woman lying unconscious behind that curtain was not just her grandmother, not just the silent old woman who raised them, fed them, patched their uniforms, and never asked for thanks. She was someone else too. Someone with a story Amaka had never asked about. Someone who had waited for decades on a bench outside a bank, not because she was mad, but because she was faithful to a promise. Or a man, or maybe both. She thought of her siblings, scattered by ambition and distance, all of them so preoccupied with becoming someone that they had forgotten the woman who had made that journey possible. They loved her, yes, in theory. In practice, they had left her behind. But now, Amaka had a name, Emmanuel Nduka, a letter, a receipt, and something buried beneath years of silence. Something she could no longer ignore. The morning after Mama Ruth's collapse, Amaka returned to Zenith Bank, file in hand, determination curdling in her chest. She approached the front desk and asked to speak with a manager. When she mentioned the name Emmanuel Nduka and the 1985 fixed deposit, the manager's expression stiffened. He flipped through pages on his screen, glanced at her, and then politely said, "I'm sorry, madam. We can't disclose account information to non-account holders. Privacy laws." She pushed the file across the desk, her voice rising. "My grandmother has sat outside this bank for 3 months. She's in the hospital because of it. You have to tell me something." But all she got was a rehearsed apology and a security escort to the exit. Frustrated, Amaka decided to go around the system. That evening, back in her flat, she called in a favor from a client in her tech network and was referred to a discreet private investigator named Mr. Otun. Within days, he was on Emmanuel Nduka's trail, sifting through dusty military records, newspaper archives, and government registries. Amaka wasn't sure what she was chasing: justice, money, answers. But she knew she couldn't stop now. Mama Ruth had entrusted a secret to silence. Amaka would pull it into the light. Say the youngest of the grandchildren surprised her one evening by knocking on her door. "I heard what happened. Nina posted some vague thing about Mama in the hospital," he said, awkward in his oversized hoodie. He looked older somehow, less aloof than she remembered. "I want to help," he added quietly. "I can search student records, newspaper archives, whatever." Amaka didn't ask why. She just nodded and cleared space for him beside her laptop. But as they dug deeper, the fracture in their family became more visible. David called from the UK after 2 missed WhatsApps. "It's a tragic story, sure, but you can't chase ghosts, Amaka," he said flatly. "There's no proof this money even exists. Don't let sentiment distract you." Nina, meanwhile, texted only to ask if the story had gone viral. People love that kind of stuff. War romance, lost inheritance. If we spin it right, maybe it'll trend. Amaka stared at her phone, sick with the realization that they had all, in their own ways, abandoned the woman who never abandoned them. They had grown into lives of curated distance, mistaking her silence for simplicity, her stillness for senility. They loved her, but only on birthdays, in captions, in hindsight. Then came the breakthrough. Mr. Otun called with findings. Emmanuel Nduka had indeed been a student of Mama Ruth's. He lost his parents in a road accident in 1970, and Mama Ruth, then still a young widow, had taken him in unofficially, raised him like a second son. He grew up, enlisted in the Nigerian army, and served during the border conflicts of the 1980s. Before he left for his last deployment, he promised Mama Ruth that if anything happened to him, he would safeguard something for her children, her legacy. Amaka sifted through Mama Ruth's papers again and noticed that the bank receipt wasn't from Zenith. It had been issued by Union Bank, which had merged assets with Zenith years later. Armed with this new clue, she returned to the branch. Again, the official stonewalled her. "There's no active account under that name," they repeated. But as she turned to leave, a younger staff member followed her out. "Madam," the woman whispered, "there is something, but I didn't tell you." They stood beside the ATM booths, invisible to cameras. "There's a dormant legacy account under Emmanuel Nduka. It has over $18 million. But," she hesitated, To access it, you need to prove kinship or show original depositor identification. The account has no listed beneficiaries. If no one steps forward in 30 days, it'll be transferred to the government as unclaimed funds. Amaka felt her breath catch. The money was real. The story was real. Mama Ruth hadn't been clinging to a delusion. She had placed her trust in someone who had disappeared into history. Emmanuel had likely died in service. He never returned to update the account, never added the names of the children he was meant to protect in her stead. And Mama Ruth, ever faithful, had waited for him for 30 years. Now, they were on a clock. Amaka returned home shaken, her thoughts racing. Mama Ruth had never tried to add herself or the grandchildren as beneficiaries. She had believed without question that Emmanuel would keep his word. She hadn't followed up, hadn't checked the account herself. She had waited, on that bench, through rain, through harmattan heat, not because she was confused, but because she believed someone was still coming. It was both beautiful and tragic, that kind of faith. The reality, however, was less forgiving. The law required proof, an ID, a signature, a link that could bridge the decades. But Emmanuel was likely dead. No obituary, no military death certificate had yet surfaced. And without that connection, the bank's hands were tied. The government would claim the account in 30 days unless Amaka found something more. That night, Amaka sat beside Mama Ruth in the hospital. Her grandmother was awake now, but weak. She didn't say much, just held Amaka's hand. "Why didn't you tell us?" Amaka asked softly, her voice cracking. Mama Ruth turned her head slightly, her eyes distant. "I didn't want you to wait like I did," she whispered. Then, after a pause, "But I hoped someone would find it, someday." Amaka felt the weight of those words settle into her chest like stone. She looked at her grandmother and for the first time saw not just the woman who raised her, but the entire life behind her, the sacrifices, the silence, the lonely hope. And now, the burden of recovering what Mama Ruth had entrusted to another had fallen to her. The race had begun. 30 days to find a dead man, prove a bond, and reclaim what had almost been lost forever. 30 days to honor the woman they all owed everything to and had barely known. Mama Ruth woke up 2 days later, just before dawn, her eyes fluttering open like the slow rising of a curtain after a long, dark play. The room was still and bathed in a weak yellow light. Amaka, half asleep in a plastic chair beside the bed, jolted awake when she heard the faint rustle of sheets. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Mama Ruth, voice thin and hoarse, asked, "Did you find it?" Tears sprang instantly to Amaka's eyes. She nodded, lips trembling. "Yes, Mama, I found everything. The account, the letter, the receipt. I know about Emmanuel. I know what you did." The words cracked halfway out of her mouth, heavy with all the things she had wanted to say but never had the courage to. "You weren't crazy. You were right." And for the first time in her life, Mama Ruth broke. Not in dramatic sobs, but in a slow, quiet undoing. Her shoulders began to shake. Her hands trembled where they lay on the hospital blanket. Silent tears streamed down her face as she looked at Amaka, looked through her curiously, as if finally letting herself be seen after years of holding herself in a tight knot of duty and restraint. She began to speak, haltingly at first, then with the momentum of memory long held at bay. After her husband's death, everything collapsed. The war was boiling, and boys, young, bright boys, were being swept away into its fire. Emmanuel had just lost his parents. She saw herself in him, alone, frightened, trying to be brave. She sold her wedding jewelry, emptied the little savings she had, and gave it to him, not to flee selfishly, but to survive, to become something greater than the world would allow him to be. "He begged me to let him repay me," she whispered. "I told him to invest it, hold it in trust. If anything happened to me, I wanted my grandchildren to have a chance." When he never returned, she feared the worst. There were no calls, no letters. The world moved on. But she didn't. Every birthday, every New Year, every first rain of the season, she would dress up and go sit outside the bank, not out of madness, but in the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, Emmanuel would walk up and say, "I've come back." Amaka held her tightly, grief and awe mingling in her chest. But then, just hours later, the twist none of them expected arrived in a WhatsApp voice note from Mr. Oton. "We found him. He's alive. He's in the US. Maryland. He's a lawyer. I have a number." It felt like fiction. Amaka could hardly believe it. They set up a Zoom call that evening from the hospital, and when the screen blinked on, there he was, older now, with a touch of gray at his temples, but unmistakably the young man from the faded photos Amaka had unearthed. Emmanuel Nduka. He stared into the camera, as if trying to reach through it. "Mama Ruth?" he asked, his voice already cracking. "Is that really you?" Mama Ruth, propped up by pillows, simply looked at him. Her breath caught. She didn't speak. "I didn't know." He continued, urgent, full of emo. "I didn't know you moved. I wrote letters, so many. They all came back undelivered. I thought, maybe you were angry or gone. I kept the account in my name, waiting for word. I was only 20. I didn't know about naming beneficiaries or estate law." Amaka watched the scene unfold like a miracle too fragile to interrupt. "I thought you forgot me," Mama Ruth finally said, her voice low but steady. "I never forgot," Emmanuel replied. "You saved my life. Everything I became is because of you." He promised to fly to Nigeria within the week. He would meet with the bank, correct the documentation, legally name Mama Ruth and her grandchildren as rightful heirs. "It's the least I can do," he said, eyes shining. As the call ended, Amaka turned to Mama Ruth, whose face was soft with something she hadn't worn in years. Peace. The wait was over. The story no longer hung in silence. The years she'd spent sitting on that concrete bench, mocked, pitied, dismissed, they had not been waste. Someone had been listening across the sea. The thread she'd trusted had not snapped. It had just stretched, far and quiet, across time and continents, until it could finally pull them back together. With Emmanuel's swift return to Nigeria, the wheels finally began to turn. His presence lent weight to the decades-old promise Mama Ruth had carried in silence. Together with a legal team, he submitted affidavits, traced old bank mergers, and pushed through the labyrinth of legacy banking protocols. Within 2 weeks, the dormant account was reactivated. Over $18 million, once frozen in bureaucracy and memory, was legally transferred to a new trust, this time in the names of Mama Ruth's grandchildren. Not a gift, but a long overdue fulfillment of what had always been meant for them. For Amaka, the journey did not end with a signature. It had only just begun. Sitting beside her grandmother during the Zoom call, hearing the weight of her sacrifices aloud, something inside her shifted. The sharp ambition that once made her ashamed of her roots softened into something more powerful: purpose. She handed in her resignation at the tech company a week later, walking away from the sterile grind of endless metrics and performative success. In its place, she launched the Mama Ruth Foundation, a grassroots initiative to support elderly women living alone or abandoned in urban Lagos. It started modestly: monthly care packages, mobile clinics, pro bono legal services, but it grew quickly, fueled by a story that had touched so many. Even David and Nina, once distant satellites in the family orbit, began to return. The inheritance was not a wedge, but a tether. Amica, now the quiet center of gravity, urged them to join her in therapy, not just for their own healing, but to unearth the grief they had all swallowed as children. David started calling more regularly, offering to fund scholarships through the foundation. Nina surprised everyone by using her influencer platform to campaign for elder care rights. For the first time in years, their family table felt fuller, not just with bodies, but with presence. As for Mama Ruth, peace didn't come in a rush. It settled slowly, like sunlight after long harmattan. The new flat Amaka and her siblings rented for her was modest but bright, with wide windows and a bookshelf that stretched across the wall. She no longer returned to the bench outside Zenith Bank. There was no longer a need to wait. Instead, she began hosting free evening classes for neighborhood children. Math, reading, sometimes moral instruction, all from the living room that had once held only silence. Her voice, once reserved and rationed, became something steady, nurturing, alive. One day, Amaka walked past the bank and stopped in her tracks. A small group had gathered outside, staring at the concrete bench where Mama Ruth had once sat in her scarf and stillness. In its place now gleamed a brass plaque, clean and solemn in the midday light. It read, "In honor of Mama Ruth who waited for hope without bitterness." Tears welled in Amaka's eyes, not from grief, but gratitude. The bench had become more than a seat. It was now a story cast in metal, a testament to faith without fury, to patience not born of powerlessness, but of love. Her grandmother had waited not for wealth, but for integrity, not for recognition, but for what was right. And in the end, she received more than money. She received legacy, in the most sacred sense of the word. The evening was quiet, almost reverent, the way dusk sometimes drapes itself around a space like a gentle shawl. Mama Ruth sat in her new living room, the hum of life drifting in faintly from the street outside. Laughter, car horns, the faint call of a hawker. But inside, it was still. She held a worn black and white photo in her lap, Emmanuel as a boy, standing shyly beside her own late children. His arms slung around their shoulders, beaming. Her thumb moved slowly across the glass frame, tracing the memory as if warming it back to life. The television played something low in the background, ignored. A kettle clicked off in the kitchen. She didn't move. She was home, in the truest sense of the word, not in brick or bed or ownership, but in peace. Amaka's voice, reflective and tender, cut through the quiet like a thread of truth. I thought she was losing her mind. But it was us. We lost our memories, our gratitude, our time. She waited for a man who made a promise, and for children who forgot they were raised on her back. The weight of those words hung heavy, not with guilt, but clarity. In forgetting Mama Ruth's story, they had risked forgetting themselves. She had lived not just for them, but with the fierce, unwavering belief that love, done right, would eventually circle back. And it had. The final image fades in, a chalkboard, slightly dusty. In a community classroom, Mama Ruth stands in front of it, back straight, scarf neatly tied, eyes full of light. With her usual grace, she lifts a stick of chalk and writes in firm, looping script, "Don't wait to be remembered. Be unforgettable by the way you love." She underlines it once, then turns to the room of eager young faces, smiling up at her.